In the 1950s, the nation was really in a panic about the rising tide of heart disease that had come from pretty much out of nowhere to be the nation's leading cause of death. In 1955, President Eisenhower himself has a heart attack, and he's out of the Oval Office for 10 days. So the nation is fixated on this problem, an urgent public health problem. Nobody really knows what causes heart disease, right? There's a number of different explanations. Maybe it's lack of vitamins, maybe it's car exhaust. So into this vacuum steps Ancel Keys, a pathologist from the University of Minnesota, and he says it's saturated fats. Saturated fats and cholesterol cause heart disease.
Of 10 men, we can expect 5 to get it.
And that was his hypothesis. He had an unshakable faith in his own beliefs. He was called a bully even by his friends, and he was able to get his beliefs inserted into the American Heart Association. So the first ever dietary recommendations telling people to cut back on saturated fat and dietary cholesterol to avoid heart disease were issued by the American Heart Association in 1961. That's the beginning of the story. It's the tiny little acorn that grew into the giant oak tree of advice that we have today and that we can't back out of. What was the evidence for that recommendation by the American Heart Association? It amounted to one study, coincidentally performed by Ancel Keys. That's the 7-country study, where he went to 7 countries around the world, mainly in Europe, but also the US and Japan. And he sampled nearly 13,000 men, and he looked at their diet, he looked at their cholesterol, and then he waited to see who had a heart attack or who died of heart disease. I mean, he had a hypothesis that saturated fat caused heart disease, and he was out to prove it. For one, it's very clear that he cherry-picked his countries. He had done a number of pilot studies. He knew where people were not eating much saturated fat and had low rates of heart disease, like Yugoslavia and Italy. And he ignored other countries, also low rates of heart disease, like Germany and Switzerland and France, where they ate a lot of saturated fats. He didn't go to those countries, which would have disproven his hypothesis. His study showed that low saturated fat intake was associated with low rates of heart disease. Associated, but it doesn't mean that reducing saturated fat is what caused those people to suffer less heart disease. It was also true that these people ate very little sugar. In fact, they also found in that study that what correlated best with cardiovascular death was sugar. Then what ensued was a tremendous amount of science to try to prove Ancel Keys' hypothesis right. Billions of dollars were spent in large clinical trials, the most rigorous kind of science you can do. And they were done in mental hospitals and veterans hospitals, the kind of experiment that you can't do anymore because it's considered unethical. And at the end of billions of dollars of research, they could not prove Ancel Keys' hypothesis.